Jonathan Lemire, how much, as you followed the president obviously very closely for the past 4 years, how much of his performance is impacted by the things you reported about yesterday, that he's trapped inside the White House, that he can't go to Mar-a-Lago, that he and his family can't get away the way they're used to getting away? How much is that weighing down on him psychologically?
Oh, it's a real factor. As much as the president, is in many ways a homebody, that he, both here in New York when he was living at Trump Tower and at the White House, he likes to spend every night, most nights if he can, back in his own bed. He does miss the road, and that's according to our reporting. He misses the rallies. He misses the time on Air Force One, which is, he really revels, and he usually brings on aides and advisors and friends to fly with him, where he works the phones. That is something he is, as someone put it to me in the last 24 hours or so, feeling cooped up, that he's feeling a little stir crazy in the building. And it's also, there's another aspect of this. He's frustrated because this whole year was meant to be about his reelection campaign. He loves the campaign. He talks about the 2015, 2016 campaign all the time. He wanted to recreate that now. And moreover, he believed going into this year, he was going to face one of two options as a general election foe. Either a socialist, in his words, like a Bernie Sanders, or if it were to be Joe Biden, Joe Biden would be weakened, that he would perhaps have to have a long, drawn-out nominating fight. Joe Biden was struggling to raise money, that he felt like he could paint him as a Washington insider. We'd start hearing about Hunter Biden again, and so on and so on. That was their argument, and that is now all, at least for now, gone away. He can't run the campaign he wants. There was a real hope on his team to use this time here, March, April, May, to really define Biden again, to have an onslaught of ads. Trump has a huge financial advantage. It would have been akin to what President Obama did to Mitt Romney back in 2012, delivering blows to Romney that he never quite recovered from. And he can't do that. He can't run an advertisement right now. It's too political. He certainly can't have a rally anytime soon. He is unable to wage the campaign he wants against Joe Biden. The only silver lining, and I will say, for him, his aides have said they're surprised they haven't seen more of Biden in the last week or two. They're surprised the Democrat has really ceded the stage to the president. I know the former vice president had a virtual town hall event yesterday, but he doesn't seem to be a real presence day after day. That's something that the White House is taking some solace in. But there's no question, to answer what you asked, Joe, part of why the president is musing about pushing things forward is he is simply frustrated about how this year, this pandemic, is defining his presidency and could take away his reelection campaign.
And this is a president who thrives on that immediate feedback. And those daily updates, I guess, are his only outlet until, I guess, this Fox News town hall, which we'll be looking at. Still ahead, our next guest says a total lockdown is not the answer to combating coronavirus. So what's the alternative? We'll find out just ahead. Plus,
and this is not a drug that obviously I think I can speak from a lot of experience because it's been out there for over 20 years. So it's not a drug that you have a huge amount of danger with. It's not like a brand new drug that's been just created that may have an unbelievable monumental effect, like kill you.
That's President Trump last week touting the potential benefits of an anti-malaria medication in the fight against coronavirus. NBC's Vaughn Hilliard has some exclusive reporting on the apparent deadly fallout from that. Next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.